She found a forgotten shelter beneath the snow. And what was inside surprised everyone. Maya Sterling returned to the family estate after nearly 10 years away, with a small suitcase on the back seat and her heart heavy from a phone call that wouldn't leave her mind. She hadn't planned on coming back. She had built a life far from there, far from the highlands, far from the cold that seeped into her bones, far from everything that land represented. But when Mrs. Martha called, her voice low and serious, the way someone who doesn't usually exaggerate speaks, Maya knew she had no choice. "Your land is being sold, dear. Silas has already agreed with a buyer. The papers are almost ready to sign." She hit the road the next day, and what she found on that frozen ground beneath layers of snow piled up over the years was something no one in the family knew existed, a hidden space that held documents, photographs, and a secret that would change everyone's history. The access road to the estate was narrow, with the asphalt giving way to packed dirt in the last 2 miles. On either side, leafless trees bent slightly under the weight of the snow. Maya knew every curve of that climb. She had run along it as a child, cried along it as a teenager, and left along it as an adult without looking back. Now she was returning, looking straight ahead, with a mix of determination and fear she couldn't quite name herself. The house appeared up on the hill, large and grey, with a snow-laden roof and smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was home. Of course they were. She stopped the car in front of the wooden gate, which creaked as she pushed it open, and stood for a moment looking at everything. The estate was large. Grandma Clara had cared for it for decades, planting, harvesting, maintaining what she could with what she had. After Grandma passed, Uncle Silas had taken over as the one in charge. At least that's what he said. The promise existed. Maya knew that. Grandma Clara had said more than once, in front of more than one person, that those lands would be Maya's. There was no formal will, no signed paper, but there was the word of a woman who had never lied in her life. And now that word was worth less than the wind cutting through the highlands that morning. She grabbed her suitcase and walked to the door. Silas opened it before she could knock. He was 63, with short-cropped white hair and a smile on his face that arrived a second after his eyes. The kind of smile that doesn't come from within. "Maya, what a surprise." "It's no surprise, Uncle. You knew I was coming." He stepped aside to let her in, as if doing her a favor. Inside, the house smelled the same as always, a mix of old wood, drip coffee made too early in the morning, and the cold seeping through the cracks of the old windows. Maya felt her stomach tighten, not from a good emotion. From physical memory, the kind of sensation the body holds onto even when the mind tries to forget. "Sit, sit," said Silas, pointing to the kitchen chairs. "Want some coffee?" "I want to see the documents." He stopped mid-gesture of reaching for the kettle and turned his face toward her. "What documents?" "The ones for the sale, Silas." He huffed, a sound between a laugh and irritation, and put the kettle on the stove anyway. "Maya, you came all this way with a hot head because of some gossip from Martha. That woman has always been a busybody. Sit down, have some coffee, we'll talk calmly." "I'd rather talk with the documents in hand." "There aren't any documents ready yet. It's all just talk, you understand? I'm only looking into options because this estate has racked up a debt you have no idea about, living so far away like you do." Maya looked at him for a while without speaking. She had known her uncle since she was a child. She recognized that way of speaking, too calm, too explanatory, the manner of someone narrating a rehearsed version. "What debt?" she asked. "Past due property taxes, maintenance on the north side fence that gave way last year, the plumbing that burst in the winter 2 years ago. It adds up, Maya. The land doesn't take care of itself." "And the sale fixes all that?" "It does, and leaves extra." "Extra for whom?" Silence. Silas turned to the stove. "We'll split whatever's left among the family." Maya didn't answer. She stood staring at her uncle's back and felt she had arrived too late, or perhaps just in time, but that the battle would be bigger than she'd imagined on the road. That night, after Silas went to sleep, she stayed alone in the kitchen for a while, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent. Outside, the wind beat against the windows with a persistence that seemed to warn of something. She got up, grabbed a candle because the hallway light was off, and went to the room that had been hers as a child. The room still held the things she had left behind: a bookshelf with old books, a dark wooden dresser, a shoebox on top of the wardrobe. She pulled the box down. Inside were old photos, folded notes, a silver chain that Grandma Clara had given her when she was 12, and at the bottom, folded in 4, a yellowed envelope with her grandmother's handwriting on the front. For Maya. Only open when you need me. She stared at that envelope for a long time, the candle trembling in her hand. Then she opened it slowly, as if afraid of tearing something that couldn't be fixed. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, small and slanted handwriting. My Maya, if you're reading this, it's because something isn't right with the land. I know that day may come, so I wrote this while I was still healthy enough to hold a pencil properly. There's something I never told you, not you or anyone else, because for years I thought it was best not to stir what was already still. But what's still doesn't mean it's right. Beneath the earth, in the northeast corner of the estate, near the old fence your grandfather never wanted to fix, there's a rusty iron lid covered with grass and snow depending on the season. You'll need to search carefully. Inside are things I kept because I didn't have the courage to destroy them and didn't know what to do with them. Now it's up to you. With love, Clara. Maya read the letter twice. Then she folded it and tucked it into her coat pocket. She stayed awake another hour, looking out the window at the snow-covered field, thinking about how many layers of silence that land had accumulated over the years. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us beginners out a lot. Now continuing. The next morning, Maya woke before sunrise. Silas was still asleep, his muffled snoring coming through the hallway. She put on her orange coat, pulled on the rubber boots she'd found in a porch closet, and slipped out without making a sound. The field was covered in a layer of snow that reached her ankles. The sky was still grey with that cold winter light that warms nothing, only illuminates. Her breath came out in vapour, and she shoved her hands in her pockets as she walked toward the northeast corner of the estate. She knew that area well. It was where Grandma Clara never let anyone play as a child, saying the ground was uneven and dangerous for running. Back then, Maya thought it was just a grandmother's caution. Now she was rereading that prohibition with new eyes. The old fence was there, leaning, its wires rusted, and its wooden posts rotten at the base. Maya stopped in front of it and began walking slowly along the line, looking at the ground. The snow was even, without any marks. It was hard to see anything beneath that white surface. She swept her foot carefully, testing the ground with each step. 10 minutes, 20. The cold burned her cheeks, and she could feel her toes beginning to go numb inside her boots. Then her right foot hit something, a muffled metallic sound. She crouched down and began to push the snow away with her hands, digging slowly. The snow was heavy, packed in overlapping layers, as if several winters had piled up there. Under the 3rd or 4th layer, her fingers found a smooth, cold surface. Metal. She dug around it, clearing a circle until she could make out the shape. A round iron lid with a ring in the center, rusted green and orange. Maya tugged hard. The ring scraped her palm. The lid didn't give at first. She adjusted her stance, planted her feet in the snow, and pulled again with all her strength. This time, with a low sucking sound, the lid came free. What was underneath took her breath away. A wooden ladder descended into a space she couldn't quite see because of the darkness. There was a smell of packed earth, old wood, and something it took her a second to identify. Kerosene. The smell of old lanterns. She pulled out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it downward. The walls were made of tightly fitted logs, smooth and dark with moisture. The floor seemed to be packed dirt, and deep down, hanging from the ceiling, were 2 rusty metal lanterns of the kind fueled by kerosene, swaying slightly with the draft Maya had created by opening the lid. She climbed down. The wooden steps creaked with each footfall, but held her weight. When she reached the ground, she stood still for a moment, just breathing. It was a large space, bigger than she had imagined from above. The log walls extended on all sides, forming a rectangular room. On one side, wooden shelves held old containers, darkened glass jars, rusty cans stacked carefully. On the other, olive-drab metal boxes, military style, were stacked halfway up the wall. In the center, a heavy wooden table with tools laid out in a row, pliers, wrenches, a hammer with a cracked handle, and a smaller box, made of light wood, covered with a piece of embroidered fabric. Maya approached the table slowly. The fabric on the box was white with blue embroidery. In the center, an initial, the letter C in cross-stitch made with the care of someone with patience and time. It wasn't the letter C of Clara. The embroidery was too old, the fabric yellowed at the edges, stiff from old moisture. She moved the fabric aside and opened the box. Inside there was a folded wool blanket, carefully placed as if protecting something fragile. Maya unfolded it slowly. Beneath the blanket were documents, folded sheets, some with edges brittle from age, certificates, lined paper covered in handwriting, and photographs. She picked up one of the photos, black and white. A woman standing in front of the house, the same house Maya had slept in that night, but looking different, newer, with windows still intact and light paint. The woman wore a dark dress, her hair pinned up, and looked at the camera with a serious but not rigid expression. It was the kind of gaze that asks for nothing, just records. Maya turned the photo over. On the back, written in pencil, Ilara Margaret Thorne, front of the estate. And below it, a date. 56 years ago. She didn't recognize that name. She had never heard that name, but there was something about the woman in the photograph that she couldn't ignore. The slightly elongated chin, the slightly wide-set eyes, the upright posture that seemed to come from within, not from effort. These were features she saw in the mirror. Maya's hand was trembling as she picked up the next sheet from the pile. It was a deed, old with the paper almost translucent from being so thin and dry. The name on the document was Ilara Margaret Thorne. The property described was that one. The coordinates, the acreage, the boundary descriptions, everything matched. The registration date was from decades ago, but what caught Maya Sterling's attention wasn't the name, nor the date. It was what was handwritten on the lower margin of the document, in a different handwriting from the main text. Transfer contested. Informal agreement. See folder C. There was no folder C in sight. Maya stood in the middle of that underground space for a good while, holding the photos and documents, hearing only the silence and her own heart beating faster than it should. There was something there that went far beyond a sale being planned by her uncle. There was an entire story that had been buried, literally under that land. She came back up with the box under her arm, closed the iron lid carefully, covered it with snow to leave no marks, and went straight inside the house. Silas was still in the kitchen, drinking coffee and flipping through an old almanac. He looked at the box under Maya's arm, and the coffee stopped mid-motion on its way to his mouth. "What's that?" "Do you know the name Ilara Margaret Thorne?" she asked. The silence lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds that said it all. "Where did you get that?" Her uncle's voice had changed tone. It was no longer the calculated tone from before. It was something else, tenser, harder. "Answer my question, Silas." "That's old stuff, Maya. Stuff that doesn't matter anymore. If it doesn't matter, why did you go pale when you saw it?" He set down the cup and stood up. It wasn't a gesture of aggression. It was a gesture of someone who needs to occupy space to feel in control. "You don't understand what you're getting into. Then explain it to me." "There's nothing to explain. There are things that were settled before you were born and that aren't your business. Land that should be mine is my business. Yes. Your grandmother Clara took care of that land for decades." His voice rose a little. "She cared for it, invested in it, suffered over this estate. What do you want to do now? Question her memory?" "I want to understand who this land truly belongs to." Silas gave a short, awkward laugh. "Truly belongs to." He shook his head. "Did you become a lawyer now?" "I didn't need to become a lawyer to know that the sale you're planning can't happen while documents like these are in circulation." He looked at the wooden box for a long second, with an expression Maya couldn't quite read. Then he turned and left the kitchen without another word, the sound of his boots fading down the hallway. Maya was left alone with the box on the table, and her heart racing, knowing she had set something in motion inside that house, and that the consequences were yet to come. In the afternoon, she went to Mrs. Martha's house. The neighbor lived about 500 yards from the estate, in a smaller house with a front garden and a porch, where there was always a rocking chair. Martha was 74 years old, with white hair parted in the middle, and the eyes of someone who had observed other people's lives closely enough to know when to speak and when to stay quiet. She opened the door before Maya could knock. "I was already expecting you to show up," said the old woman, opening the door wider. "Come in, I have homemade biscuits." Mrs. Martha's kitchen was warm and smelled like cumin. Maya sat at the table and placed the wooden box in front of the woman. "Do you know what this is?" Martha looked at the box, then looked at Maya, then opened it slowly. When she saw the photo of Ilara, she was quiet for a while, a silence that carried weight. "Dear Lord," she murmured very softly. "Did you know her?" "I was a child when she left," said Martha, her voice careful, like someone stepping on ground that might give way. "But my mother told me about her. Everyone around here knew about Alaide, but nobody ever spoke openly about it, because Silas's father was an intimidating man, you see." "Silas's grandfather." "Right. His great-grandfather on his uncle's side, a man named Arthur. He was what they called influential around here, the kind of person people obeyed without really knowing why. And Alaide was the original owner of those lands. Her family had cultivated them for generations. Maya felt something click into place in her chest, the way it clicks when you confirm something you already knew without knowing. "What happened to her?" "She left." Mrs. Martha paused. "My mother used to say she left on her own, but the way she said it made it clear that wasn't quite the case. There was an agreement. Signed documents, they said, but my mother never actually saw those documents with her own eyes. She only knew that after a while, Alaide had vanished from the area and Arthur was on the estate as if it had always been his." "And Grandma Clara?" "Clara came later. She was the wife of one of Arthur's relatives, a nephew, I think, who took over the land after the old man fell ill. Your grandmother was a good woman, Maya. She didn't know any of this. At least that's what I believe." Maya kept staring at Alaide's photo. That chin, those eyes. "Mrs. Martha, this woman in the photograph, do you think she had children?" The old woman took a moment to answer. "My mother mentioned she did, but the children were raised far from here. They grew up not really knowing where they came from, or so they say." She looked at Maya. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'd look a lot like her if we were from the same family." The silence that followed lasted longer than the others. "My dear," said Mrs. Martha very slowly, "do you know anything about your Grandma Clara's story before she came here?" Maya opened her mouth and closed it. Actually, she hardly knew anything. Grandma Clara didn't talk about the past. She was the type who lived in the present with all her might, and the past remained like a locked room in a house with many bedrooms. Maya had grown up thinking that was just her grandmother's way. Now she was holding the key without knowing which door to open first. She went back to the estate with her head full of questions that still had no answers. Silas was in the shed, tinkering with tools, and didn't greet her when she walked by. Her uncle's son, Caleb, was standing outside, leaning against the car with his phone in his hand. He was 38, built like his father but with a more reserved manner, eyes that darted away too quickly. "Hey, Maya," he said, without taking his eyes off his phone. "Caleb, do you know what your father is planning?" He looked up. "Selling the estate. Do you agree with it?" He put his phone in his pocket and shrugged slightly. "It's his land. He decides." "It's not his land, Caleb." The young man stayed quiet. "Grandma Clara made it clear that this land was supposed to be mine," she continued, her voice lower. "You know that. What Grandma said is what she said, but what's on paper is another matter." "Exactly. And what's on paper might be more complicated than what your father is telling you." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, and looked back at his phone. But there was something different in his eyes now, a small crack that Maya noticed and stored away. That night, she stayed up late in the kitchen, with the documents spread across the table, trying to make sense of it all. The deed with Alaide's name, The marginal note about an informal agreement. The embroidery with the initial C that wasn't Clara's. There were pieces there that didn't fit together. In the early hours, while the wind howled outside and the snow beat against the window panes, she did something she hadn't done in years. She closed her eyes and stayed quiet, just listening. Not the house, not the wind. Herself. What do you know that you haven't said out loud yet? The answer took a while, but it came. Ilara could be family. Not the line she knew, but one that had been severed and buried along with that box in the ground. And if so, there was someone out there carrying that blood without knowing about the land that had been taken from them. The next morning, before breakfast, Silas called her into the living room to talk. "Sit down," he said with a tone different from the day before. Calmer, more careful. She sat without taking off her coat. "Look," he began, running a hand through his white hair. "I know the situation seems bad from where you're standing, but there are things you don't know. Debts I wasn't mentioning because I didn't want to worry you. Then worry me now. The plumbing on the north side, the fence, the property taxes, adding it all up, it's an amount I can't cover. I'm old, Maya, I can't work the land like I'd need to. Selling is the only way out I found. And the documents I found under the ground." His expression hardened for a split second, then went back to neutral. "Old paperwork. It has no legal standing." "You don't know that, Silas. I know more than you think. And that's exactly what worries me." He sighed deeply, like someone tired of an argument that shouldn't be happening. "Do you need a lawyer? I can get you a lawyer. We'll do everything right. But in the end, you'll see that selling is the way. Who's the buyer?" A pause. "A guy from out of town wants to use the land for planting." "Name? Do you need to know the name?" "Yes. Grant Holloway." The name meant nothing to her. But the way Silas said it too fast without hesitating, like someone who had rehearsed that specific answer, said a lot. "When do you plan to sign?" she asked. "We're waiting on an engineer's appraisal to finalize the price." "Give me 10 days. He looked at her. 10 days for what? To understand what's in those documents. Maya. 10 days, Silas. If I don't find anything relevant, you do what you want with the land. He stared at her for a long time. Maya didn't look away. It was something she had learned as a child from her own grandma Clara. When you're in the right, your eyes don't lie, and when the other person knows you're in the right, they're the ones who look away. Silas looked away. 10 days, he said, as if doing her an enormous favor. She went to the bedroom and stayed there for a good while, her head resting against the cold wooden wall, thinking. The question that wouldn't leave her head was simple and impossible at the same time. If Ilara had children, where were they now? The next day, Maya woke up with the sun still low and a determination that had ripened while she slept. There was one person she hadn't sought out yet, the buyer, Grant Holloway. The name Silas had said too fast. She asked Martha for the contact at the local county clerk's office and went there before lunchtime. The clerk, a young guy with big glasses, said he couldn't provide information about ongoing negotiations, but he turned red when Maya mentioned the name Holloway. Red enough for her to understand that the name was known around there. Later, in a conversation at the corner market, where everyone from the area passed through sooner or later, she overheard an old man with white hair telling the cashier that the guy who'd been trying to buy land in the area had done the same thing in 2 other places in recent years. Buys cheap, splits it into lots, sells it dear to outsiders wanting a summer house in the Highlands. The man said it with the air of someone who doesn't approve, but also doesn't know what to do about it. Maya stopped, a jar of honey in her hand. It wasn't planting, it wasn't a farm. It was speculation. Silas had said the buyer wanted to plant, and he was lying. She went back to the estate and stood in the kitchen, waiting for her uncle to come in from the fields. When he walked in and saw the way she was standing, he stopped too. "Holloway isn't going to plant anything," she said bluntly. Silas laid his coat on the chair. "How do you know?" "Because his story is about dividing land and selling lots." "Did you know that?" He fell silent. "You knew," she repeated, not as a question. "I knew he had other businesses. What he does with the land afterward isn't my concern." "Yes, it is." Because you said he was going to plant to justify the low price he's offering. If he's going to divide it into lots, the land is worth 3 times what you're accepting." Silas stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. It wasn't irritation. It wasn't shame. It was something more complicated, the kind that comes when you're caught not in a lie but in a simplification that turned into a lie because it was easier that way. "I needed to close the deal quickly," he said, his voice lower. "The debts are real, Maya. I didn't make that up. Show me the debts." He went to the bedroom and came back with a thin folder. He set it on the table. Maya opened it and flipped through. Maintenance bills, property taxes, an invoice for a plumbing repair dated the previous year. The amounts were real. Not exorbitant, but real. "This I can handle," she said after adding it up in her head. Silas looked at her. "You don't have that kind of money." "Not right now. But if we suspend the sale, I have time to get organized. I can take an advance on my work. I can sell the car I've had stored away for years without using. I can find a solution that doesn't involve throwing away decades of this family's history." He looked at the folder, then at her, then at the window. Outside, the field was grey under a heavy sky. "Why would you do that?" he asked with a sincerity she hadn't expected. "After everything, why would you cover the debts of a piece of land that's in dispute?" "Because it's my land," she said simply. "And because Grandma Clara spent her whole life taking care of it and deserves someone to keep doing that." The silence that followed was different from all the others, more honest. On the 3rd day, the storm that had been threatening since Maya's arrival finally hit. The snow fell thick from mid-morning, blurring the outlines of the field, the trees, the fence. The temperature plummeted. She stayed in the house, rummaging through everything in the old cabinets and rooms, looking for something that might complement what she had found in the box. It was in a hallway cabinet that she found, hidden behind folded blankets, a manila folder. On the front, written in ballpoint pen with handwriting that wasn't Grandma Clara's, "Folder C." Maya's hands stopped. She grabbed the folder and went straight to the kitchen where the light was better. She sat down and opened it slowly. Inside was a set of statements, loose sheets of different sizes, some typed, some handwritten. One of them was a statement signed by 4 people affirming that they had witnessed a verbal agreement between Ilara Margaret Thorne and Arthur Vasconcelos for the transfer of the estate in exchange for payment of a debt Ilara had incurred. The amount mentioned was modest, absurdly small for a piece of land that size, and the witnesses' signatures were accompanied by a note in pen, different from the others, that said, "I signed without reading it through. I didn't really know what it was about." MC Maya read that note 3 times. It was the handwriting of someone with little education, the lines uneven, the letters poorly formed. But it was an admission that the agreement had been signed without full understanding. If that person was still alive, she would be a witness. She went to Mrs. Martha's house that same afternoon, even with the snow falling heavily. "MC," she said, barely stepping into the old woman's kitchen. "Do you know who that is?" Martha blinked, picked up her glasses from the table, and looked at the sheet Maya had placed in front of her. "My goodness," she murmured softly. "Do you know who it is?" "MC." Martha took off her glasses and set them down carefully. "It could be Mabel Crawford, an old woman who still lives nearby, down by the river. She's still alive, 82 years old, and chops her own firewood." Martha looked at Maya with something between admiration and warning. "But she doesn't like to talk about old things. Never did. I need to speak with her." "I know you do." The old woman stood up with some effort. "But you'll need me to get her to open the door." They went together, in Maya's car, slowly down the snow-covered road. Mabel Crawford's house sat in an isolated stretch, surrounded by tall pine trees that held snow on their branches like winter decorations. Smoke rose from the chimney in a lazy spiral. Mrs. Martha knocked, waited, knocked again. The door opened. Mabel Crawford looked exactly like someone who chopped her own firewood at 82. small but sturdy, with large hands and dark eyes that were in no hurry at all. "Martha," she said. Then she looked at Maya. "Is this her? She's Clara's granddaughter, Mabel. I was expecting someone to show up one day," said the old woman, opening the door wider. "Come in." The house was simple, warm, with a plank floor and walls covered in framed portraits. They sat down in the living room. Maya placed the sheet in front of Mabel. The old woman looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then, "I signed that when I was 16. Arthur was the kind of man you didn't say no to, not out of fear of getting hit, you understand. It was a different kind of fear, the fear of being left out, of being cut off from the community, of having your husband out of work on the farm. That's how he operated." "Did you know what you were signing?" "I didn't know everything. I knew Ilara was leaving and that the estate was changing hands. I thought it was the right thing being done. I only understood later, much later, that it wasn't." "Would you be willing to make that official?" A written statement signed with notarized acknowledgement. Mabel looked at Martha. Martha looked at Maya. Then they both looked at Mabel. "Should have done that 40 years ago," said the old woman, with a firmness that wasn't in the childish handwriting of the note. "Tell me what you need." Maya returned to the estate with a lighter heart for the first time since she'd arrived, but with her mind busier than ever. There was still one missing piece. Ilara's descendants. If they existed, they had a right to know about the land. Not just Maya. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Inside the wooden box there was also a letter. She had seen it, but in the rush of the documents she had left it for last. Now she read it carefully. It was from Ilara to a son named Julian, written years after she left the estate. In it, Ilara described the lands with a longing that hurt to read. The smell of wet earth in the spring thaw, the color of the field in the afternoon when the sun hit from the side, the sound of the wind in the pines at night. But what held Maya were the last lines. "Son, I'm keeping this because I know that one day you or your children will want to know. I won't waste what strength I have left fighting. But I leave the story here so that someone, when the right time comes, can do what I couldn't. Julian." It was a name to search for. She called a college friend who had become a historical records researcher and asked for discreet help. To find an Ilara Margaret Thorne and a son named Julian from a Highlands region decades ago, it took 2 days. 2 days during which Silas was quieter and more tense, spending more time on the phone than usual, leaving early and coming back with a closed-off manner that Maya watched from the corner of her eye. Caleb showed up every now and then, with no clear reason, like someone circling around waiting for something. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Maya's friend called back. Julian Thorne had passed away years ago, but there was a daughter. A woman named Miriam Thorne Rivers, 71 years old, living in a town 2 hours away. Maya stood still, phone in hand, 71 years old. Alaid's daughter was still alive. She left without saying where she was going, got in the car, and drove down the highlands slowly with the fine snow hitting the windshield. The town was bigger than she expected, with a busy downtown and quiet residential neighborhoods on the outskirts. The address her friend had found led to a street of old houses, with well-kept gardens and large trees. The door was opened by a woman who, at first glance, made Maya feel like she was looking into a mirror decades apart. The same face structure, the same chin, the same slightly wide-set eyes. Miriam Thorne Rivers had short white hair and a look that assessed without hostility. "You're the one who called me?" Miriam asked. "I am. My name is Maya Sterling." The woman blinked. "Sterling. I know that name might not be good for you to hear." Miriam opened the door a little wider. "Come in." The conversation lasted 4 hours. It started slowly, with suspicion on both sides, like two people who need to make sure the ground is solid before taking the next step. Maya told everything. Martha's call, the documents, the box, Ilara's letter. Miriam listened without interrupting, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes alternating between the documents Maya was placing on the table and her face. When Maya finished, Miriam was silent for a long time. Then, "My father never brought us here. He knew there was an estate, knew that my grandmother had been taken from it in some way he could never properly describe. But we grew up without an address, without a concrete reference. It was a family story that existed without a map. Now there's a map." Miriam looked at the photograph of Ilara for a while. "She was my grandmother," she said, more to herself than to Maya. Then she looked up. "And what do you want with all this?" "I want the truth to be known, and I want the sale of this land not to happen until her story is resolved." "You don't need me for that." "I need you if you want a part of what's rightfully your family's. I don't need you if you just want to hold up the sale." Miriam stared at her for a while with a hard-to-read expression. "You have her face," Miriam said finally. "My grandmother's." "I know. I saw it in the photo." "How do you explain that?" "I still can't explain it. I just know it feels like our stories are tangled together in a way neither of us understood before today." Miriam stood up, went to the window, and stood looking out at the garden. The sun was low, orange, typical of a winter late afternoon. "I'll go," she said after a long silence. "I need to see that land once in my life." Maya felt something loosen in her chest. They agreed that Miriam would come the next day. Maya walked down the house's stairs with the strange feeling that she had done something irreversible, but irreversible in a good way. Back at the estate, she found Silas waiting in the living room. He had lit the fireplace, and the room was too warm for the season, as if he had needed the heat on purpose. "Maya," he said without getting up, "do you know that what you're doing is going to create a much bigger problem than the one you're trying to solve? I know it's going to create a problem for you, for both of us, for the whole family. When you open up a story like that, you can't close it again. Maybe it doesn't need to be closed. Maybe it needs to be told." He let out a snort. "Told to who? To bring outsiders in to claim a piece of land your grandmother Clara watered with sweat her whole life? Did grandmother Clara not know what she was stepping on?" The silence was so thick that Maya thought it would fill the whole room. "She knew," Silas said finally in a different voice, lower, older. "In the end, she knew. That's why she left that damn letter. It was the first honest thing he had said since she arrived, and it caused more damage than all the previous days combined." Maya stared at her uncle for a while, seeing in him, for the first time, not the cold and calculating man he had shown himself to be over the past few days, but someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and who perhaps was tired too. "Tell me," she said, softer. He took a while. He stared at the fireplace with his elbows on his knees. "My grandfather Arthur told me when I was about 20, not as a confession, as an explanation of the world. He said that back then that's how things worked, that those with money and status did what needed to be done, that Ilara had signed of her own free will." Pause. But the way he told it, you could see he didn't really believe it himself. "And you stayed on the land even knowing?" "It was my inheritance." His voice hardened for a second, then softened. "It was all I had." "And Grandma Clara?" "She found out closer to the end. I don't know how, but she did. She stayed quiet for months. Then she called me and said the land should be Maya's." He looked at her. "When I asked why you specifically," she said, "because Maya will know what to do with the truth." Maya felt her eyes sting. "Why didn't you tell me this when I arrived?" "Because I thought I could close this before. Sell, split, end it, without having to dig up the past." But the past was already being dug up, for a long time. He didn't answer. He stared at the fireplace. That night, Maya slept the heavy sleep of someone who had been awake inside for many days. The storm had passed, and the silence of the snowy countryside was deep, almost solid. Early in the morning, before anyone else woke up, she went back to the shelter. This time she went down with a real flashlight she had found in the pantry. She stayed down there for a good while, examining the shelves, the containers, the metal boxes. There were things there that told a life. jars with carefully stored seeds, old farming tools, a pair of leather gloves hardened from so much use. Ilara had set up that space like someone keeping memories she knew might be needed one day. But what Maya found on the last shelf, hidden behind a rusty can, took her breath away in a different way. It was a small hardcover notebook, the kind used for accounting, with yellowed but intact pages. Inside, written in a tiny, precise handwriting, was a record of the entire history of the estate. Dates, names, transactions, witnesses, values. It was Ilara's accounting diary, and on the last pages, in a different handwriting, more shaky, but recognizable as the same older hand, with love to whoever finds this. The land was mine. It can also be yours. When Maya came up with the notebook, Miriam had already arrived. She was standing at the entrance gate to the estate, with a small suitcase and her gaze lost in the snow-covered field. She had the same dark coat as always, with a red scarf that contrasted with everything around it. When she saw Maya coming from the direction of the field, with the flashlight in her hand and snow up to her knees, she raised her hand in a wave. Maya approached and placed the notebook in front of Miriam without saying a word. The woman opened it and read the last page. Only the last page. Then she closed it and stood looking at the estate with an expression that Maya couldn't describe, because it was a mix of things that don't usually appear together, mourning and arrival. "She kept this here?" asked Miriam. "She kept it here. For how long?" "Decades." Miriam took a deep breath. The air came out in white vapor. "My grandmother was stubborn," she said, with a slow-building smile. "My father always said that she was the type to plant the seed even without being sure she'd see the tree grow." "The tree grew," said Maya. They were silent for a moment, side by side, looking at the house. That afternoon, the two of them sat down with Silas at the kitchen table. It was a long, difficult conversation, with silences that took up space like an extra room. Miriam didn't come with anger. She came with questions. Silas answered some, dodged others, but with Miriam in front of him and the documents on the table, the weight of what had been done decades ago became more concrete than any argument he could offer. Caleb came into the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, saw the scene, and stood in the doorway for a second. Maya watched him out of the corner of her eye. There was something different in the way he looked at his father. "Dad," he said, with a firmer voice than Maya expected, "I think you need a county clerk's office." Silas looked up. "A county clerk's office?" "To do this right." Caleb walked into the kitchen and sat down. "If we're going to settle this, let's settle it for real, no shortcuts." Silas stared at his son for a while, then, "You're on her side now, too." "I'm not on anyone's side. I'm on the side of doing what needs to be done." The silence that followed was different from the others, less heavy, as if something had given way. The next day they went to the county clerk's office in town. The person in charge was a man named Mr. Miller, about 50 years old, with thin-rimmed glasses and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent his whole life dealing with papers that carried human weight. He examined the documents from the box carefully, flipping through page by page without rushing. At one point, he paused, glasses pushed up on his forehead, staring at a spot on the ceiling, like someone doing a complicated calculation in his head. "There are inconsistencies here," he said finally. "The transfer of deed in our records doesn't match what's in these original documents. Legally speaking, that's significant." "Significant how?" asked Silas. "Significant in that it can block any sale until it's resolved." Mr. Miller looked over his glasses. "And with the notebook and that lady's statement?" "Mabel Crawford," said Maya. "With her testimony formalized, we can contest the legitimacy of the original transfer." Silas stayed quiet. Caleb looked at his father. Miriam looked at Maya. "What happens to the land while this is being sorted out?" asked Miriam. "Any negotiation is suspended," said Mr. Miller. "No one sells anything while the process is open." Silas closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was something different in them. Not exactly defeat, more like someone setting down a weight they'd been carrying much longer than they should have. "Tell me what I need to sign," he said. No one expected that. The silence lasted a full 3 seconds. "Silas," said Maya cautiously, I heard what Mr. Miller said. He looked at her. And I heard you and Miriam and Caleb. A pause. And I've been hearing my grandfather Arthur in my head since last night, telling that story like it was a lesson in how the world works. And I thought about how absurd it is to carry that as a lesson. The air in the room changed, lighter, in a way that had nothing to do with the heater. Maya looked at Miriam. Miriam looked at Maya. And in a split second, they both understood that something had broken there. Not in a bad way, but the way a knot comes undone when someone has the courage to pull both ends at once. But before the formal process could move forward, there was a setback. Silas called the more distant relatives of the family by phone. Cousins that Maya barely knew, who lived in different cities and had little contact with the estate, but a lot of interest when it came to money. Within 2 days, she received 3 calls from people whose names she barely knew, saying their uncle had told them she was trying to take the land for herself, that she had brought in an outsider to claim ownership, that she was stirring up trouble that would only hurt everyone. The last call was the hardest. A cousin named Brooke, who spoke fast and with a conviction clearly fueled by a very specific version of the story, said that if Maya didn't back down, the family would contest any agreement she tried to make. Maya hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, the silence of the house all around her. There were moments when the land seemed too big to defend alone. She called Miriam. The conversation started practical and gradually became human, the way it happens when 2 people have been through something big together, and the guard naturally drops. "Do you still want to go through with this?" Maya asked. "With my uncle's family taking that stance, it's going to get more complicated." "Are you asking me if I'm going to give up?" said Miriam, her voice almost holding a smile. "I'm giving you the chance to back out without embarrassment." "Miriam, I'm 71 years old." A brief pause. "My grandmother was taken from a land that was hers with all the strength she had. My father grew up not knowing where his roots were. I grew up not knowing. My children grew up not knowing." Another pause. "No, I'm not giving up." Maya closed her eyes for a second. "Then we're not giving up." "We're not giving up." It was that same week that Caleb showed up at Maya's door early one morning with a yellowed envelope in his hand and the look of someone who hadn't slept well for several days. "I need to give you something," he said. She let him in. He stood in the kitchen without sitting down, as if he needed to be ready to leave at any moment. "This was in a shoebox at the bottom of my father's closet," he said, handing her the envelope. "I found it when I went to look for a document he asked me for last week. I read it. I shouldn't have read it. But I did." Maya took the envelope, opened it. Inside was a sheet folded in 4, with a shaky, uneven handwriting. The handwriting of someone already old or already sick or both. It was from Arthur. About 20 lines, written like someone not used to explaining themselves and knowing this is the last chance. He described what he had done with Ilara's lands, not with grand remorse, not with self-punishment, with the dryness of a man who knows what he did and thinks putting it on paper is the least he can do, even if it's not enough. At the end there was a line that Maya read 3 times. "I leave this here because I don't know what else to do with the weight. May whoever finds it decide what to do." She stared at that last line for a while. "Did you tell your father you found this?" she asked Caleb. He was silent for a second. "No." A pause. "I spent 3 days thinking. And then I came to bring it to you." He looked at her. "I know this will be used against my father in the case. It will. That's fine." He said this with a firmness that clearly came at a cost. What was done, keeping it covered up won't undo it. Maya folded the sheet carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you, Caleb." He just nodded, picked up his car keys, and left without another word. But before walking out the door, he stopped for a second and said, without turning around, "My great-grandmother had a photo of Ilara. My father showed me once when I was a kid and said she was a woman who had lived around here. He never said anything else." A pause. I should have asked more. He left. Maya stayed in the kitchen with Arthur's note in her pocket and the weight of it all settling on her chest like snow that arrives slowly until it covers everything. There was an afternoon 3 days before the hearing at the county clerk's office when Maya almost lost faith in the whole story. She had come back late from a conversation with Mr. Miller, tired and with her head full of terms. She tried to understand, but that slipped out as soon as they came in. The snow had returned, thin but persistent. She entered the house, put the kettle on the stove, and leaned against the sink, staring at nothing. Then the phone rang. It was a distant cousin named Brooke, whom she barely knew, but who had called twice that week after Silas had spread his version of the story to the distant relatives. "Maya, you need to stop this. My mother got sick with worry over this lawsuit. The doctor said stress isn't good for her. Do you want to be responsible for that?" Maya was silent for a moment. "Brooke, I'm sorry that your mother is worried, but her health isn't an argument against the truth of what happened with this land." "What truth? You showed up here after almost 10 years with a story about old papers and a woman no one knows, and you want to destroy the family." "I don't want to destroy anything. Your grandmother Clara would be ashamed of you." Maya closed her eyes for a second. That hurt. Not because she believed it, but because words that use the people we love as weapons always hurt, even when we know they're unfair. "Good night, Brooke," she said and hung up. She stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand for a long time, and for the first time since she had arrived, she cried. Not out of sadness exactly, but out of exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from defending something right in a world that makes difficult what should be simple. Then the crying passed. The kettle whistled. She made tea, sat at the table, and stayed there until the cold inside her chest subsided. The next morning she woke up determined again. She had learned this from Grandma Clara without realizing it, that you can cry at night and get up in the morning with the same determination as before. That crying isn't weakness. It's just the body's way of reorganizing what the mind has accumulated. But the day before the hearing brought yet another surprise. Martha called early in the morning, her voice strained. "Maya, Silas went to Mabel's house yesterday afternoon." Maya set down her coffee. "To do what?" "Mabel called me last night. He went to tell her she didn't need to get involved in a family fight, that the story was old and that signing that testimony would only cause trouble for her too. He stayed about 40 minutes. And her? Mabel is 82 years old and spent her whole life doing what she thought was right, even when no one asked. She said she listened to everything, served coffee, thanked him for the visit, and when he left, she called me. Maya let out the breath she had been holding. "Is she going to sign?" She said, "Tell that girl I'll be at the county clerk's office in my best clothes." There was something both comical and deeply moving about that. Maya hung up and sat for a while with a smile she hadn't planned on having, thinking that some people reach a certain age and gain a clarity that younger folks take much longer to achieve. Caleb witnessed his father's visit to Mabel without Silas knowing. He had gone to get tools from the shed near the road that passed by the old woman's house and saw his father's car parked there. He didn't go in. He stayed outside with a heavy heart and heard through the open window part of the conversation. That same night he looked for Maya. "You already know he went to see Mabel," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I know. I saw." Maya stared at him. There was a transparency in the young man's face she hadn't seen before, as if a layer had been peeled away. "Caleb, you don't have to do anything with this." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "But I want to. Not because I'm against my father, because it's the right thing." She said nothing more. Sometimes the right thing is just to stay quiet and let the other person find their own path, without anyone having to point the way. The formal process took weeks. Mabel Crawford signed the affidavit with a steadiness that moved everyone at the county clerk's office. The handwritten statement that Caleb had found in an envelope at the bottom of a drawer, written by Arthur himself years before he passed, with the trembling hand of an old man who knows he's running out of time, was presented as additional evidence. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Maya woke up in the early morning hours weighed down by the possibility that none of this would work, that the documents would be deemed insufficient, that Silas would change his mind, that Miriam would give up. There were days when the snow outside seemed heavier, denser, as if winter were on the side of silence. But Mabel didn't back down. Mr. Miller worked on the paperwork with an attention that went beyond duty. Caleb started showing up more often at the estate, helping with the small repairs his uncle had let pile up, without asking for anything in return. And Miriam stayed. She stayed in the Highland town for that entire week, lodged at Martha's house, who welcomed her as if she had known Ilara's family for decades. The two of them sat on the porch late into the night, even in the cold, drinking tea and chatting with the calm of people who have plenty of time for that conversation. One afternoon, Maya went to visit them and found Martha showing Miriam an old black-and-white photo that had belonged to her mother. The photo showed a group of people in front of the estate, years before anyone present was born. In the center of the group was Ilara, next to her a small child. "That one there is your father," Martha said to Miriam, pointing at the child. Miriam stared at the photo for a very long time without saying anything. Then she pulled from her coat pocket the photo that had been in the wooden box, the one Maya had found in the shelter, and placed the two side by side. "She stayed here long after I thought she did," Miriam said softly. "My father thought she left soon after, but she stayed long enough to keep all these things. She stayed until the very last moment she could," Martha said. Miriam carefully folded the photos and tucked them together into the same pocket. That night, Maya was alone at the estate for the first time since she'd arrived. Silas had gone to spend a few days in the city, Caleb had gone home, and the countryside was completely silent. She lit the fireplace, made some tea, and sat down in Grandma Clara's old chair staring at the flames. She thought about her grandmother, about what she had hidden and why, about the weight of knowing about an injustice and not having the means or the courage to undo it, but having the clarity to leave clues so someone else could. There was a quiet greatness in that, the kind that doesn't appear in stories told out loud, only in the silence of a winter room. She thought about Ilara, who had built that shelter with her own hands, stored those documents with a patience that only those who believe truth outlasts time have, who had written that letter knowing she might not live to see the result. She thought about Miriam, who had grown up without a map and found one on a winter afternoon in a town she didn't know, in the hands of a woman who wasn't blood family but seemed like family, in some other way that blood doesn't explain. And she pondered for a long time the physical resemblance between her and Alaide, the chin, the eyes, the posture. There was a question there that she hadn't voiced aloud to anyone, because some questions need to be heard internally before they can be spoken. Grandma Clara had said the land should belong to Maya, not to any other relative, specifically Maya, and she had said this after discovering Alaide's story. Why? The answer forming in Maya's mind was too big for a single night, but the warmth of the fireplace helped sustain her. The following week, she asked Mr. Miller to check if there was any record of kinship between the Thorne family and the Sterling family in the archives of the county clerk's office and local churches. It was a request she made with the calm voice of someone already prepared for what might come, but with her heart beating differently. The answer took 3 days, and when Mr. Miller called, his voice had that specific tone of someone about to say something that shifts the axis of a conversation. "Maya, I'd need you to come here in person. There's a record here that you need to see with your own eyes." She arrived at the county clerk's office half an hour later. Mr. Miller was holding a sheet of paper, old, made of thicker stock, with the seal of the civil registry from decades past. "Ilara Margaret Thorne," he said, placing the sheet on the desk, "had 2 children. Julian, father of Miriam, which you already knew, and a younger daughter, given up for adoption under circumstances the record doesn't detail, at a time when that kind of thing happened without leaving much documentary trace." Maya looked at the paper. "The name of the adopted daughter," Mr. Miller continued, his voice careful, "is listed as having been received by a family named Sterling." The silence that followed was the kind you carry in your body for a long time. "My grandfather's family." Maya's voice came out quieter than she expected. "It seems so. I can't say for sure with 100% certainty without a more detailed examination, but the coincidence of name, time, and region is too great to dismiss." Maya stared at the paper. The child's name was recorded as adopted by a family called Sterling, on a date that roughly corresponded to the time when Ilara had left the estate. A child, a daughter, who had grown up, who had had children, whose children had had children, and one of those children had returned to that land without knowing she was coming home in a way that went far beyond what she thought. Maya left the county clerk's office walking slowly, like someone who needs time for the ground to feel real beneath their feet. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear, a dark blue of a late winter afternoon. She stopped on the sidewalk and stared up for a long while. Ilara had lost 2 children in one afternoon. One had been raised at a distance without knowing about the land. The other had grown up in arms that weren't hers, in a family that carried the name Sterling without knowing there was a story of loss within that name. And Grandma Clara had discovered this. That was why she had said the land should belong to Maya. Not just out of emotional choice, but as recognition of something that time had twisted but not erased. When Maya returned to the estate and told Miriam, the two of them were silent for a very long time. The fireplace was lit. Outside, night was slowly closing in over the highlands. "We're related," Miriam said finally, her voice holding both surprise and a lack of surprise, like when you hear an answer that part of you already knew. "It seems we are." "On Alaid's side." "On her side." Miriam looked at her hands in her lap. Maya looked at the fire. "I don't know how to deal with this," Miriam said. "It's too big to take in all at once." "We don't have to deal with it all at once," Maya replied. "We can take it slow." The process was concluded on a day of clear sky and a mild chill, the kind of cold you can handle just fine with a good coat and a cup of coffee in hand. Mr. Miller gathered the parties in the county clerk's office and explained what had been decided based on the documents and Mabel's testimony. The original deed in Ilara's name held legal precedence over the later transfer, which had been made under irregular conditions, without the full and informed consent of the witnesses, as Mabel had formally established. Based on that, the sale planned by Silas was cancelled. The estate would need to be re-registered. The solution they reached wasn't imposed by anyone. It was built over a long afternoon of conversation around the kitchen table, with tea, with homemade biscuits Martha brought, with Caleb present and silent most of the time, but present. The section cultivated by Grandma Clara over decades went to Maya Sterling in recognition of the labor and affection of the woman who had cared for that land without knowing the whole truth but with all the strength she had. The original part, the historic core of the estate where the shelter area was, the oldest pine trees, and the grandfather's old fence he never wanted to fix, was recognized as belonging to Ilara's descendants, which included Miriam and her children. Silas got a smaller plot, enough to maintain a vegetable garden and the house he had built with his own hands on the eastern edge of the estate. He didn't protest. He signed the documents with a pen that trembled a little, and it wasn't from illness. Caleb signed as a witness, and after everything was signed, he stepped into the hallway and stood alone for a minute. Maya found him there, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "It's strange. It feels like something that was crooked went straight, and you don't realize how heavy the crooked thing was until it straightens out." Maya understood exactly what he meant. The day they opened the shelter for good, not to look for documents but simply to look, was on a Saturday morning with low sun and a gentle chill. Maya, Miriam, Martha, and Mabel went together. Caleb stayed up top, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the field. They went down the wooden stairs one at a time. Mabel was last, slowly, holding the railing with both large hands. When she reached the packed earth floor, she stood looking around with an expression Maya had never seen on a face before, recognition of a place she had never been, but somehow already knew. "Alaidi set this up," Mabel said, more to herself, "with these hands of hers." The old lanterns still hung from the ceiling. Martha had brought a battery-powered lantern, and the amber light illuminated the shelves, the boxes, the tools lined up in a row. Miriam went to the seed shelf and picked up one of the glass jars. She shook it gently. The seeds tapped against the glass with a small, dry sound. "Think they'll still germinate?" she asked. "Some probably will," Maya said. "Should we plant them?" "We'll plant them." There was no speech. There was no grand gesture. Just those 4 women in a space that had held decades of silence, breathing the same cold air, listening to the faint creak of the wood above them where the weight of the snow still rested. And then, slowly, like someone careful not to break something fragile, they climbed back up together into the sun. Spring arrived without giving a specific date, as always. The snow disappeared in layers, slowly, and the field emerged beneath it with the color of wet earth that has a smell found nowhere else in the world. Miriam came back twice in the following months. She brought her sons on the second visit, two young men who walked around the estate with the air of people trying to understand what a piece of land means beyond what the eyes can see. Maya stayed. She took a leave from work that stretched on, then resigned, then realized she had spent years building a distant life because she didn't have the courage to return to the one that was truly hers. Silas, on the east side, planted a small vegetable garden. It grew larger than he expected. One afternoon he showed up on Maya's porch with a bunch of cilantro in his hand, without warning, without explanation. "It grew too much," he said, holding out the bunch. "Thank you," she said, taking it. There was nothing more to say, and also so much that maybe one day would be said, calmly, around a table with hot tea and enough time. Mabel Crawford stopped cutting wood by herself. She passed that task on to her grandson, who lived in the city but started showing up every week. She said she had done something important in the winter, and now could rest a little more without feeling she owed anything to life. Martha was pleased with all of it in a way she didn't try to hide. She was the type of person who believes that truth has legs, and it's just a matter of time until it gets where it needs to go. The old fence on the northeast corner was fixed by Caleb on an afternoon in March. He went alone, without inviting anyone, and worked all day. When Maya passed by there at the end of the day, the fence was straight, with new posts and taut wire. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Because it was crooked." She smiled. It was the same thing he had said in the hallway of the county clerk's office. But now it sounded different, lighter, like a sentence that had found the right place to land. The shelter was left open, not as a museum, not as an attraction, just open. The iron lid was removed and replaced by a wooden door with hinges, which could be closed but not locked. The documents were taken out and deposited with Mr. Miller for formal safekeeping. The tools stayed, because tools belong where tools are, and Ilara's little notebook stayed with Miriam. She took it home on her second visit, inside a cloth bag that Maya had sewn to protect the pages. Before leaving, Miriam stood in front of the estate for a moment, looking at the house with that same gaze from the first time she had arrived, a mix of grief and arrival, but this time there was something more. A lightness, the kind someone feels when they've found what they didn't know they were looking for. "We'll come back in the winter," she said. "We'll be waiting for you," Maya replied. And that's exactly what happened. The following winter, when the snow returned to cover everything and the field was white again, Miriam came back with her children and her youngest granddaughter, who was 5 years old and wanted to go down to the shelter as soon as she heard there was a hidden place underground. The little girl stayed below, looking at the shelves, and asked what it was all for. Miriam crouched down beside her and said, "Someone kept the most important things they had here, so that we could find them one day. Why didn't they just hand them over? Because sometimes you can't just hand them over. Sometimes you have to wait for the right time." The girl thought for a moment. And did the right time come? Miriam looked at Maya. Maya looked at Miriam. "It did," they both said, almost at the same time. The girl accepted that as enough of an answer and went back to exploring the shelves with her eyes. Up above, through the open wooden door, the winter sky was the deepest blue the Highlands winter offers, and the snow, quiet and white and honest, covered everything that was wrong and everything that was right with the same thickness, without distinction, as snow always does, without judgment, until someone has the courage to dig. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. That same winter, on a Saturday afternoon, when the cold kept everyone indoors, Maya went to the northeast corner of the estate alone. She stopped in front of the wooden door of the shelter, which was closed but not locked, as always. She stood there for a while with her hands in the pockets of her orange coat, looking at the field around her. The field was different from what it had been when she first arrived. Not dramatically different, not in a way that any outsider would notice right away, but different in a way she could see. There were footprints coming and going in various directions, where before there had only been her single path arriving. There was a visible vegetable garden in the distance on the east side. There was a straight fence where before there had been a crooked one. There was life moving across that land in a way she hadn't seen when she first came. She thought of Grandma Clara, not with the usual sadness, but with a kind of gratitude she had taken time to learn how to name. Her grandmother had done what she could, with what she had, in the time she had. She had kept a letter, she had planted a seed, and she had chosen well who would find it. We don't always choose well, Maya thought, but when we do, it makes up for everything that went wrong before. She opened the shelter door and went down. She stayed down there for a while with the flashlight off in the dark, listening to the silence. It was a different silence from the first time, less heavy, more complete. The kind of silence that comes after the words that needed to be said have finally been said. Then she turned on the flashlight, looked around one last time, and came back up. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story that touched so many hearts. Comment below if you would also keep those secrets or have the courage to open the lid. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.